are in listen-only mode.
Oxford Computer Group's monthly webinar series. Today we're going to be discussing governing Microsoft Teams with Saviynt Security Manager. My name is Frank Urena. I'm a principal architect with Oxford Computer Group. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Oxford Computer Group, we are a identity and access management consulting firm specializing in all things identity and access management related. I have been working particularly around the Microsoft security and identity stack for many years, starting out with what's now known as MIM, or Microsoft Identity Manager, for just a non-premise solution for provisioning, deprovisioning, and identities across Active Directory and a host of applications. And of course, more recently with the cloud in Azure AD, providing identity solutions for customers utilizing Azure AD for single sign-on, provisioning, deprovisioning, the entire identity lifecycle. Joining me today is Dave Culbertson. Dave is with Saviynt, and I'll let Dave do an introduction.
Sure, thanks, Frank. Hi, folks. Dave Culbertson with Saviynt. I'm a senior solution strategist. What my role is functionally is to support partners such as OCG and our entire channel ecosystem. Been with Saviynt a little over 2 years and have been about 20 years overall in the identity and access management space. With that, I'll pass it back to Frank.
All right, so our agenda for today is we're going to be discussing, as mentioned in the title, governing teams, but as you see in the agenda, that first bullet point is an overview of groups, and we'll explain why groups plays a critical part in governing teams. Some common governance requirements for user access and data control, the team's governance gap analysis between Microsoft with what Microsoft has as a native solution, plus what Saviynt adds as a partner to that solution, and some common use cases for IGA, particularly around teams. And then we'll have a few minutes left for Q&A at the end. So to begin, before I get started here, we're going to just put up a poll question, since we are talking about teams, and we know, especially since the global health crisis has taken place, that many have deployed teams and are using it more and more with remote workforce. So we're going to launch this poll here and just appreciate your responses in terms of how has your organization deployed teams. So we'll give a few seconds for some responses to this question. All right, we'll close the poll. We've got collected about 70% of attendees responded, and it seems like the overwhelming majority is yes, 100% deployed. So this content will be obviously particularly useful to you. And to start off, when we talk about teams, that's why we have the title slide here. Teams is not an island, right? Because when we talk about teams, of course, Teams is a collaboration hub, right? What happens when you deploy a team? Well, a number of things occur. First, there's, of course, an associated SharePoint document library that gets created, which, of course, OneDrive sits on top of SharePoint, so there could be some OneDrive storage locations as well that are being utilized for individual users. You may have a OneNote notebook that's also being loosely coupled with that team. which will have content. There's, of course, a loose coupling again with Yammer. And although the groups in Yammer and the groups and teams are different, there's still that tie-in. There could be a shared mailbox resources using Exchange, Exchange Online that's also tied in. Plus, these are just the Microsoft applications. If you look at how when you build teams and what you can add on, there's a bevy of third-party applications that you can also connect to your team to provide that true collaborative space for your users. Now, the foundation, of course, for Teams as a collaboration solution in Office 365 or now Microsoft 365 is Microsoft 365 groups. Again, mentioned when you create a team, you're essentially creating a Microsoft 365 group in your environment. And we know that the main issue with groups is even in on-prem situations with Active Directory, there's always been a problem of group sprawl, where groups are created, but sometime down the line, we're not really sure if that group needs to be retained, who's the owner of that group, who's a member of that group, do they still need to be in that group? So these are some of the common governance requirements and problems that come along with deploying Teams as you're deploying all of these groups and being able to get a handle on them. But then there's also the content aspect of it. We mentioned there's SharePoint and there's other repositories where data is being kept. How are you managing and keeping track of that data becomes very important as well. Now, within Azure AD, so when you do deploy Teams and you're deploying these groups, there are some basic, what you might term governance rules around them. But for the most part, what we're seeing is, customers either are not applying these native governance tools, which is really kind of governance light from what we're talking about, and they're leaving the default. So these are just some screen caps of if you go to the groups area in Azure AD, the self-service group management, for instance, this is a feature that's turned on, which basically means that anybody in your organization that's using Teams today, if these defaults are left as they are, they essentially can deploy Teams. So if they can deploy an M365 group, they can deploy a team. So again, you look here in the self-service group management settings in your tenant, you'll see that that the ability to restrict access to groups is usually left to no. There is no restrictions for that. For O365 groups specifically, the ability to create groups is left on. It's set to yes, again, meaning that users can easily just spin up teams as needed, which is not to say that that's a bad thing, because that does lead to a nice frictionless environment. Users can be very productive. They don't have to seek permission every single time they want to spin up a team, because we know if they were doing that, they probably would just use other methods to try to get around those policies. So we're not saying that you necessarily want to start restricting access to group creation, but because you are allowing that, again, it draws attention to the need for some governance around that. Same thing with security groups, another area that we're leaving turned on, but we're usually not going back to see to manage and govern those groups. Some of the newer features that are available in Azure AD, for instance, there is an expiration policy that you can set. So there are some kind of built-in governance capabilities within Azure AD. So this is one example where you can set lifetime expirations on groups. You can have email notifications for groups that have no owners, or ordinarily the notification for an expiring group would go to the owner. But if you have groups that have no owners, because the group has essentially been orphaned after an owner has left the company, you can have an email address set for that. And then you can also enable expiration for those groups within Azure AD. There's also a group naming policy. So you can configure custom blocked word lists so that you can make sure no one is using profanity or other words that would not be allowed in the environment. and set up a standard structure, a naming convention policy for your group. So those are some of again the native features within Azure AD, and they work generally well, especially if if you're just using all Microsoft technologies. Some of these native features might serve a purpose, but as we know in any enterprise, you're not just using Microsoft, you're using third-party applications as well. And one of the use cases that we'll talk about and how Saviynt helps in this area, addresses that particular concern. Now, from a content perspective, again, you're creating teams, you're creating groups, but you're also creating locations where users can store documents. Word documents, Excel, PowerPoint, PDFs, you name it, they're going to be part of a team. That's how users collaborate generally. It's not just about instant messaging or video conferencing. There's a work product that's being created, that's being stored in these locations. And so if you look at the layers here, right, on the right, we have that content storage, right? So that's OneDrive, that's SharePoint. It could even be Box. You could have, third-party Box, for instance, that could be added to Teams. And when it comes to your Microsoft 365, you have that first layer, which is that perpetual layer, which is just about talking about the availability of the service, its performance, any APIs that you can connect to, encryption, indexing, and of course, intelligence around identity, who can access it, providing single sign-on, etc. And then you have that user centric layer, and this is where all the magic happens, right? This is where people are spinning up teams, they're collaborating, they're being very productive, which is what we want, which is what management wants. We want users to be productive and to use the tools. But oftentimes we're seeing this middle layer here, that policy-driven layer, which is where policies are created around data retention and classification, and protection is usually lacking. We have all of this content available. Users are able to share it not only internally but also externally with partner organizations and even outside. And this is where that governance really becomes important. If you're leveraging, for instance, unified labeling in Microsoft 365 today, that's great, but without a mechanism to be able to review that access and ensure that the right people have the right amount of access to that information, and for especially sensitive information that they are being restricted from sharing it outside of the organization, it becomes really important to focus on that policy layer. Again, that's where a combination of Microsoft and Saviynt come in handy. So when we talk about IGA, information governance, there are several functional capabilities, and when we talk about that capability in Teams, we are particularly focused around just four of these. Of course, there's the identity lifecycle, so making sure that your joiner, mover, leaver processes are mature and that they're working for you. There's an access request process. Again, some native functionality within Microsoft 365 itself, but in most organizations, they find that they need an enhancement to that access request process. There's entitlement management, which again we can refer to as group governance, because as far as Teams is concerned, it's all tied to a group, and it's membership within that group that entitles you access to that particular team. So how are we managing and governing that entitlement management? And then access certification, which is essentially telling and reporting against who still needs access within that group. Is the right access being provided? So if we look at the capabilities for Microsoft, as indicated here, and in terms of what Azure AD provides from an ILM perspective, and IGA, of course, single sign-on is one of the main use cases for Azure AD as an identity as a service solution. conditional access, multi-factor authentication. These are all things that would also fit into a zero trust model if you're starting a journey down zero trust. But when it comes to that governance piece, there are some areas where there is some complementary overlap with Saviynt. So for instance, the user provisioning. Right now, to provision users into Azure AD, of course, you do have Azure AD Connect, and that can provision from your Active Directory environment, which is great. It works fine. But what about other on-premise applications or third-party applications? How are those being managed? Well, that user provisioning is one of the functions that Saviynt can provide. Their access request system. Saviynt provides an enhanced access request process, which includes AI, machine learning, which is able to deliver a risk, a rather frictionless access request system to multiple, with multiple levels of approval in the environment with their workflow. And then there's the areas where Saviynt is going to provide and fill in those gaps, like with fine-grained entitlements, separation of duties, compliance controls, entitlement and access risk, and also continuous monitoring and enforcement of those policies. And so with that in mind, we'll put up our second and final poll question of the day before I hand it over to Dave to talk about some of those use cases. And so this question is, does your organization have currently an IGA solution? So we'll give about 50 seconds or so to get some responses on this question. Okay, appreciate the participation in that. Gives us some insight into what's being used, and it looks like good amount currently doesn't have an IGA solution, and about the same number is currently using Saviynt. And so be interested to hear some of the use cases and how Microsoft and Saviynt really can bring governance to teams. So let me turn it over to Dave at this point. Let me give you control here, Dave, just a second.
Sure. Well, while he's doing that, I'll go ahead and just kind of reiterate to what Frank was talking about, and I want to stress this, very heavily, that we're a complementary solution to Microsoft, right? We're not looking to rip and replace any processes or technology that you're currently leveraging from the Microsoft stack. We have a very good technical relationship with Microsoft. We work very closely with their teams. We actually have very deep integration across the breadth of their stack, and we've actually been showcased as one of the premier security solutions in the 50 some odd MTCs around the globe. So if you've ever been to a Microsoft Technology Center, we are actually one of the feature third-party applications available for consumption there. So I believe I have control now, so I'll go ahead and kind of take us on the next step of the journey, which we want to talk a little bit about some of the typical use cases that Oxford and ourselves are approached with when it comes to specifically governing teams, and in some cases, kind of the broader overarching identity governance administration capabilities that we provide. So one of the more common ones that we get is, we get customers come to us and say, we've got an HR system that is kind of our authoritative source for identity in our organization. Or maybe they have multiple systems. We need to be able to provide access to users on the first day and then handle their whole JML, join remover lifecycle throughout the entire tenure that they're with the organization until they're terminated. And then we also want to be able to do access reviews on a periodic basis to help us with our compliance as well. And so, understanding the Microsoft stack, of course, Azure AD provides some basic, provisioning of teams. It's primarily group-based. As some of the things that Frank talked about in, earlier in the presentation. Azure AD can certainly do access reviews of teams, specifically the Azure AD Office 365 groups, but it does require some customization in order to go down to the data level and actually do reviews of who has access to what data in the unstructured stores like SharePoint, which is effectively where Teams channels manifest. And then the other kind of major challenge when leveraging Azure AD is there is somewhat of a limited workflow capability in the product, in that it has a couple levels of approval. But if you have a very complex approval process or a out-of-band approval process, or something that needs to marry to a kind of a legacy process within the organization, then extending that to support that can be challenging and or perhaps not even possible. So when we talk about what Saviynt brings to offer, so we do as well Azure AD Group Management, but we also have ownership and workflow-driven succession management. So Frank talked about a little earlier where we could assign a kind of a group or a group email or an email to notify when a Teams group gets orphaned within the organization. It's very important, that we do know the notification, but Saviynt can actually orchestrate the entire workflow so that succession management happens organically. Not only is there a notification that happens, but a workflow kicks off to actually handle the transfer to the appropriate user, so that when it comes time to do access review certifications, that we don't have an issue where certain groups and teams aren't being reviewed. From a provisioning and deprovisioning, Saviynt does very, very fine-grained capabilities across that, from not only users, groups, roles, but attribute level provisioning, which can flag and change effectiveness for an authorization perspective within applications as well, not just group level capabilities. And as I mentioned before, Saviynt has kind of N-level capability for approval, so there's really no limit to the number of levels of approval within the platform. It uses a graphical design app to actually build those workflows. We also provide an integration with Azure B2B for controlled management of guest access. And what's interesting there is that when we do this, it's a native integration with Azure B2B. So the invitation process is actually facilitated by Azure B2B, and effectively the authentication capabilities within Azure B2B are what allow us to do the orchestration, if you will, of the registration of the user within that. It just requires a basic setup within Saviynt to be able to configure the create user request, and from there the workflow pushes it out to Azure B2B, and the rest of the workflow is essentially facilitated through Azure from that point. I wanted to touch back also. Saviynt also has the ability to create teams and channels within MS Teams. This is a relatively new capability within our platform. And one of the things that you may think, well, why would I go outside of Teams in order to create teams? And I think that's effectively the problem, especially as a lot of us have been thrust into remote work over the last several months. Teams have been created kind of willy-nilly, if you will, right? I mean, literally, without little control or without a lot of thought about not only why the team was being created, for what purpose, but what was being shared within that team, who was being invited to that team. And so having an IGA solution kind of steward over the control of that, to put that through a workflow process where somebody has to approve a creation of a team or a channel, and who is going to be assigned to it, gives you a lot more governance control on the front end versus a post-mortem, after the fact kind of approach. Another thing that we'll talk about here too is that and I certainly understand that Microsoft has a lot of capabilities for non-Microsoft applications as is supported through Azure AD. But there's a lot of capability on the Saviynt side as well for non-Microsoft applications, and a lot of focus around fine-grain entitlements. So again, this is very fine grain in terms of either attribute level, or if we're talking about something like an SAP, down to the T code transaction level, those kinds of things. And we support very deeply both on-premise and in the cloud. So we're not restricted to just SaaS applications or AD or Azure AD bound applications, but across a gamut of what I'll call Iron native or data center native type applications as well. And then finally, when we talk about access reviews, there's a lot of different ways access reviews can manifest within the Saviynt solution. One of which is they can be set to run at a periodic campaign cycle. So in support of traditional SOX or PCI type compliance initiatives, where it's required to do some sort of interval driven access review. We also have the ability to be able to do risk event driven, so that as a user's access change or as an anomalous behavior of a user is detected, we can flag that and actually do a single user campaign with that user's manager or with the application owner in order to determine if that is truly authorized use, and then shut that access down if it's not. So we have that kind of mitigating or remediating control ability in line within the access review process within the Saviynt platform. And then, like I said earlier, one of the challenges with doing campaign reviews or certification reviews within Azure AD is there's not a lot of visibility to being able to do that at the data tier level. So looking at the unstructured data to determine who has access to what. So another use case that we commonly see is customers coming to us and saying, hey, look, I've got a ton of sensitive data out there, personally identifiable information, intellectual property, personal health information, payment card information, et cetera. And we're pretty sure that it's being shared with external users. How are we going to handle this? Or we may even have SOD type constraints where we have people in finance touching HR data or vice versa, right? So how do we prevent those things? And so again, Microsoft has some really good capabilities in the Azure Information Protection Platform, AIP. It can do all the things that you would expect. It can scan and classify files, which is probably one of the single biggest issues in getting a handle on where sensitive data lies is being able to inspect those files and classify it. So that's a really good thing. One of the downsides, however, is that in many cases it requires fairly extensive reconfiguration of Exchange and potentially SharePoint. And then if you're dealing with a mix of new and old clients, there may even be a need to have endpoint client installations that you have to manage, which is kind of a challenging model when you talk about having to deploy agents out on endpoints across your network. And then finally, one of the bigger challenges onto it as well is that there's not a clear mapping between specific user identities and the content that they have access to. It's fundamentally managed by groups and so forth. Excuse me just a moment. So when we talk about what Saviynt does on the sensitive data side, we can certainly leverage the labels that AIP has put on our data. We can use that to compose Saviynt-born policies, but we can also within Saviynt scan and classify data ourselves. So if you don't leverage AIP today or don't have the resources to stand that up, Saviynt can support that scanning and classification of data in the SharePoint environments and in other cloud storage environments, as well as in some cases on-prem for unstructured data and for structured data. Saviynt also can map the data policies to users via roles and groups and attributes. And we also have policy-based mappings of users to specific classifications of data. So based on your organizational function, for instance, within the organization, we may say that you have access to this type of data or you don't have access to the data at a blanket level, or also what lower level policies or file ACLs may say that you can do. There are literally dozens of out-of-the-box classification rules for the typical PII, PHI, and PCI type data structures. But we also provide some really good configuration capability in the platform using a combination of regex and JSON and other formatting tools to define intellectual property. So, because intellectual property varies by your organization's needs. So we have a way to describe what IP looks like so that we can use that as part of our policy engine as well. And then fundamentally, we can provide these really simple dashboards to view status and to see kind of in real time who has access to sensitive data and understand, are we exposing that data to a guest user, for instance? And if so, what are we going to do about it? We can actually even do mitigation and remediation, again, on the fly as an event-driven either access review process or through our own remediation panel within the platform. Excuse me. So the last thing we'll talk about in terms of use cases is the governance for dashboards and reporting. We have a lot of customers that are very concerned about standard compliance controls, whether it's ITGC, which is IT governance controls, or whether it's CIS benchmarks, or you name the flavor. And what they're really trying to get at is looking for misconfigurations in the environment of teams or of other supporting solutions that surround teams to make sure that there's not open vulnerabilities in the environment, and to be able to have that continuously scanned, to be able to look for it in real time across the breadth of your infrastructure, whether it's the Teams platform itself, or whether it's, again, supporting applications that may be integrated with Teams, or infrastructure that may be integrated with Teams for various different purposes. So again, Microsoft provides some really good dashboarding capability for Teams. In general, it's not really focused specifically on compliance, or more specifically, it's not really focused on compliance frameworks like the ITGC framework. If you can extend Microsoft to support that, it would be a customization or a deep configuration effort in order to be able to do so. There's also no real mechanism within Azure AD or within Teams itself to do mitigation and remediation of detected violations. And so when I find something, how is it dealt with? I mean, an email notification that a team has changed owners, or the team's owner is no longer in the organization is great, but what's the follow-up mechanism? What are the controls in place, and where's your audit evidence to be able to take to your auditors? And then finally, if you really want to get powerful dashboards, you could certainly use a solution like Power BI and build those great dashboards, but that's going to require time, energy, and effort. And it's also going to require somewhat of an understanding of a potentially complex data model within Teams to be able to mine that data out and visualize it the way you wish to. So on the Saviynt side, Saviynt has out-of-the-box 50 different actionable controls that look at the ITGC benchmark, if you will, and measures Teams and other applications against that to look for misconfigurations, very common misconfigurations, like having Teams channels exposed to external users that potentially have sensitive data in them, or Teams that have, for instance, a lot of guest users with no significant employee user monitoring or managing the team. The other point I made earlier, which is these controls are kind of continuously monitored, and in particular, when I say they're continuously monitored, they're constantly looking for the misconfigurations, and as soon as one is detected, it's elevated in terms of both a notification email that goes out to designated people in the IT risk organization. And then those individuals can come into the Saviynt portal and actually document the mitigation or perform remediation activities to be able to correct that, or to go correct the configuration issue in Teams, and then come back and note that that has been corrected and close that out. So almost like a case management system, if you will, for being able to manage control violations when those occur, and they do occur. right? Through not necessarily through malintent, but in many cases through rapid deployment and oversight. And then finally, the dashboards that we provide give really simple at-a-glance visibility to auditors and IT risk. And so you can look at the reports visually and get very quickly a good read on where you stand in the environment. And then if you really want to dig into it and mine under it, there are reports that sit underneath each of the tiles in the dashboard that let you go into much deeper level detail. That report data can be exported, and you can even build pivot tables in Excel or whatever your favorite business intelligence tool is. So this is kind of some examples of when we talk about the dashboards. This is just two of the many dashboards that are available and configurable within the Saviynt environment. The one on the left, access visibility of teams, is essentially looking at a lot of those ITGC controls and trying to figure out, if there are owners in, teams owners in the organization that are disabled, and raising that awareness. And so from that, when I can drill under these tiles, I'm taken to a report that actually shows me who the violators are and allows me to actually mitigate or remediate that immediately thereafter from within that same panel. Likewise, on the data side, very similar type visualizations. It's a little more graphical, if you will, in terms of being able to visualize what's going on with my PCI data or my PII data or my PHI data within the organization. And then again, being able to drill into these charts to look at where the violations are occurring, either in what share it's being violated, or ultimately what users are associated with that, and deal with it appropriately. Maybe it's just simply reassigning a user to a correct role to make sure that their access is adequate. Maybe they certainly have legitimate access, but in order to validate that and be able to change the behavior, you have to be made aware, and then you have to be provided a set of actionable controls. So I want to kind of wrap it up by giving a kind of a visualization here, and please don't make fun of my artwork. I'm not the best drawer of diagrams, but I did want to kind of lay out that if you think about what Saviynt can bring to the picture, again, we're not looking to offset or displace the many robust capabilities that exist in Azure AD and specifically in Teams and other Microsoft solutions like MCAS or AIP. We're looking to be a complementary solution. We kind of view ourselves as the epicenter around, or the enabler technology around all of this, right? Because we can take those data feeds in from one or more HRMS sources. By the way, Dynamics HR could also be one of those. We're not limited to the types of HR sources that come in. We handle the whole join, remove, reliever event behavior and bring that in, and then based on role and policy within the Saviynt Express solution for Teams, we actually have the ability to look at that type of event and assign birthright roles to be able to handle the join, remove, reliever behavior over time, and then of course terminate access appropriately on the back end when we receive those events from HR. We also have the ability to elevate and escalate these change requests that come in, whether they're user initiated or delegated administration initiated, so that we can send work tickets to an IT service desk. And again, I know that certainly in Microsoft Dynamics and in the old Great Plains, there was some service desk functionality there. Yep, we can do that too. But the more common ones we see out there are things like ServiceNow and Sharewell and so forth. Ultimately, to be able to have visibility in the IT operations group for service management and to handle things like manual processes, we can push that off, and we can actually handle opening and closing tickets within that as well. And then, if you look downstream from where Saviynt fits in, we can do the full lifecycle and orchestration across the breadth of not just Microsoft, Azure, and Teams, and the rest of the Microsoft ecosystem, but we expand into AWS and Google and a lot of other on-premise, what I'll call native data center applications, including things like SAP and Oracle EBS, and so forth. So it's a very broad solution. Today's topic, we were focused very heavily on teams and trying to navigate around what we can do to extend teams, but we know a lot of organizations out there fundamentally don't have a pure Microsoft environment. And this is really where we shine. We shine in a very heterogeneous environment. But again, we're here to complement and support the Microsoft infrastructure and to essentially elevate the investments that you've already made, both in terms of time and configuring those products to work and solve your business needs, but also in terms of your financial investments with your Microsoft 365 licenses and so forth. And then finally, I think I'll kind of close with this. Whoops. I'll kind of close with. I went one too far. Sorry about that. I'll close with this, and that again, while we were mostly focused today on teams and how Azure AD and Saviynt complement and do governance around teams, but the Saviynt Saviynt ecosystem for Microsoft is very, very broad. We have a big focus on cloud security around Azure infrastructure. So a lot of those same types of controls where I talked about ITGC controls for teams. We have CIS benchmarks and other sets of controls that are heavily focused on both regulatory and benchmark frameworks for Microsoft Azure. We have a tremendous amount of functionality around the monitoring of shared data and the management of access to all M365 applications that are sitting out there. We do a really good integration with the whole Power Platform, focused primarily on identity lifecycle around those who has access to things like Power BI or Power Apps, and making those available in a catalog. And then we do what we do best, I think, in the Dynamics 365 space, whereas we provide for a lot of these ERP applications, which I would classify Dynamics 365 in, especially since they've expanded over the last several years into a very broad portfolio of ERP type functions, including finance, including HR functions, and so forth, that we find ourselves working, in a GRC space, in a true classic GRC space, focusing on segregation of duty violation, management, mitigation, remediation, and providing an inspection tool that does continuous monitoring for those, both in a preventative way in terms of not allowing users to request access for things that are considered toxic combinations, but also in a detective way, so that if there are existing violations that go against policy out there in the realm where something happens through a misconfiguration that exposes a toxic combination to a group of users, that's elevated very quickly through continuous monitoring of the Dynamics 365 application. So with that, I'll close and I'll turn the floor back to Frank, and we'll see if we have any questions on the line. I think to ask questions, you'll need to submit a question into the chat box, correct, Frank?
That's correct. And thank you, Dave, for that. So we do have a few minutes left. If there are any questions, we'll certainly entertain those. You can feel free to just type them into the questionnaire here on the GoToWebinar interface.
And while we're waiting on that, Frank, one of the questions that we get approached with very commonly, and I know you guys have done a lot of work in the space, is, hey, I've got a MEM environment, and it's fairly well deployed. At least see for my organization size, it's a fairly well deployed, provisioning solution. It's meeting basic needs, but we've heard mixed reviews from Microsoft what the plans are. We haven't made the migration to Azure AD from a provisioning perspective. What's the thought process there, and how can Saviynt complement those things? And so I have an answer for that, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that, Frank, as well.
Sure. No, it's a great question. And so oftentimes one of our most common use cases when we are deploying Saviynt in environments is they have MIM deployed, and number one, Microsoft is still officially still supporting MIM and still supporting MIM for use cases like provisioning accounts into third-party on-premise applications that have not been migrated to the cloud, where Azure AD provisioning might make a little more sense, but also in those instances where you have an on-prem HRIS solution. It could be one of the well-known ones like PeopleSoft or SAP, or some custom solution, and in some cases for many organizations that we work with who have been involved in some sort of merger and acquisition activity, we often find multiple, right? So MIM is still the solution for that type of onboarding process, provisioning process from those types of systems, and then outbound to, like I said, AD and third-party applications. Oftentimes what we do is, Saviynt is dropped in again as that governance layer. So if you really view it as that, the way I think about it is that independent auditor, which is nice to have kind of outside of the environment. So MIM is able, or Saviynt is able to take that information that's in MIM as the identity repository, and then be able to build your SOD rules around it, your access request rules, your attestation campaigns around that information without necessarily having to reinvent the wheel, because we've got connectors that can connect from MIM to Saviynt. So that's probably the most common use case that we see. And oftentimes, we're not seeing customers ready to fully abandon MIM and their MIM deployment, because they've made quite an investment, and once it's in place, it just really seems to work, and it's a well-oiled machine at that point. And let's not forget, again, Microsoft is still fully supporting MIM for the foreseeable future. Your thoughts on that, Dave?
Yeah, it's pretty comparable. I mean, I think the biggest thing we look at is, again, we don't have to look at it from a rip and replace. So it's not an either or type scenario. In fact, to your point, many of our customers who have MIM deployed come to us on the governance front first, right? And trying to add that layer of oversight, that layer of inspection to be able to do periodic access review, or to be able to apply, SOD policies across the breadth of what MIM is automating the provisioning and deprovisioning of. So we see that as a very common use case. We have customers that say, okay, look, for the things that we're doing right now, we're not going to change that. So MIM needs to continue to handle that. But for everything that we're going to do in the future, rather than investing more cycles in configuring MIM, we're going to configure those use cases in Saviynt. And one of the interesting things is that you can choose to have the single pane of glass be Saviynt for all access requests, and MIM can be the fulfillment engine on the back end, for instance, for the things that MIM's already handling, and for everything that Saviynt would be handling. Again, Saviynt is still the single pane of glass for access requests for access into those things as well too. So it really depends on the use case or the request of the client, what they're looking for, but we certainly we certainly see a fair amount of it as we're talking with customers out in the landscape. We see tremendous amount of MIM still out there in the wild, and I don't think it's I don't think it's going away anytime soon. So we felt like a complementary strategy versus a rip and replace strategy was certainly the way to approach it.
Yeah, great. We only had one question, and that was, is the deck going to be sent out? No, we're not going to be sending the deck out, but the recording of this webinar will be posted on our website at oxfordcomputergroup.com. So feel free to rewatch and take any notes away from the recording there. So we've given a few minutes for questions. It seems like there are no other questions coming in, so we appreciate everyone's time today. We know your time is valuable. There's a lot going on, but we do appreciate that. Oh, before I'm about to close out, we do have a question. Does Saviynt use AIP labels defined in Azure Information Protection, or use its own data protection policies? And Dave, I know you have an answer for that because we talked about that.
Yeah, we did talk about that. Yes, the answer is yes and yes. So we can certainly take the labels that AIP has already produced and build our policies based on that. There's no challenge in that you can continue to leverage AIP to do your continual scanning and labeling, and we can just ingest those labels to create policies within Saviynt, and then do what we do, which is really focus on determining that identity mapping to who has access to certain labels of classified files or sensitive files within the organization. And then secondarily, if you don't have AIP, we have a full scanning and classification engine within Saviynt that allows us to do the same kind of thing, and we actually have a lot of out-of-the-box policies already defined for looking at personally identifiable information, payment card information, personal health information, and then we have a very well-defined structure for being able to create those focused on the customer-specific intellectual property items as well too. So yes and yes, either way you want to go from that perspective, we can support using what you already have with AIP. If you're not using AIP, we certainly help you there by extending the overall Microsoft ecosystem and giving you the ability to scan that unstructured data, classify it, and then build policies based on it.
Great. And then the question came in: is there a live demo of the MS Team integration with Saviynt? So I know we have a Saviynt environment, and if there's anyone interested in seeing a demo, we can certainly set something up for that. I mean, right now, obviously, we didn't include any demos in this webinar because some of that work just requires specific integration and some customization to do that. But feel free to reach out to us. If you,
I'll tell you too, Frank, while we're on the topic. So we just updated our listing in the Azure Marketplace for Saviynt, and Saviynt is now co-sell ready in the Azure Marketplace. So partners like Oxford can leverage the marketplace with Microsoft, with your Microsoft rep to be able to deliver Saviynt to you. And the other cool thing about that is that in the listing are both solution guides that talk about what we do, so PDF files, 1- and 2-page PDF files that explain all the things that we do for Microsoft, Teams being one of those, and we have a host of videos where we actually show and demonstrate capabilities of the product. I am the voice on that. Yours truly is the MC for those videos, and they're hosted as well right there in the Azure Marketplace. And so contact Oxford. I'll make sure that they have the link if you don't know how to get there in the Azure Marketplace. But if you just go to Azure Marketplace and search for Saviynt or Saviynt Security Manager, it'll take you straight to it, and you'll be able to watch some demonstration videos there. And of course, as Frank alluded to, if you want to have a serious conversation with us, we'll be happy to help do a demonstration for you live.
Great. Thanks for that, Dave. Good information to have. All right, so with that, again, appreciate everyone joining us today. Again, if you have any questions after this, feel free to reach out to us, and we will be happy to have a follow-up conversation. Other than that, we will end our broadcast now and look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Dave, you have a great day.
Thanks, Frank. Appreciate it. Y'all have a nice one.
Bye-bye.